In the summer of 2021, a 19-year-old forensic science student named Rebecca Martinez was researching unsolved cases for her senior thesis when she came across a photograph that would haunt her for the next 18 months. It was a school picture of an 11-year-old boy with gap-toothed smile and freckles across his nose, a boy who had been murdered in 1978 while delivering newspapers on a foggy October morning. What Rebecca discovered in her tiny dorm room would accomplish something that 43 years of professional investigation, hundreds of interviews, and countless dead ends had failed to achieve. This is the story of how a college student with no badge, no gun, and no authority became the person who finally brought a killer's name into the light. Before we dive into this absolutely mind-bending case, I want to say welcome. Whether you're a long-time listener or this is your first time here, I'm so glad you're joining me. If you find yourself getting pulled into this story, and trust me, you will do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It helps more people discover these stories, and it means the world to me. All right, let's buckle up. Because what happened in the small town of Riverside, Oregon in 1978 would change everything about how that community saw itself. And what happened 43 years later would prove that sometimes the most important investigators aren't the ones with the most experience, they're the ones who refuse to give up. Timothy James Holloway came into the world on a snowy January morning in 1967. The third child and only son born to Robert and Patricia Holloway. His parents called him Timmy, though his two older sisters, Linda and Susan, preferred Tim when they weren't teasing him, which wasn't often. The Holloway family lived on Maple Street in Riverside, a town of about 8,000 people nestled in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. If you've never been to Oregon, picture this: dense forests that seem to stretch forever, morning fog that rolls through the valleys like a living thing, and small towns where the biggest excitement on a Friday night was the high school football game. Riverside was that kind of place, the kind where everyone knew everyone, where you could leave your front door unlocked, and where the worst crime was usually somebody's teenager spray painting the water tower. Robert Holloway worked as a foreman at the lumber mill that employed half the town. It was hard, physical work that started before dawn and didn't end until well after dark during the busy season. He was a quiet man, the kind who showed love through actions rather than words, fixing his daughter's bicycles, teaching Timmy to fish in the Riverside Creek, never missing a single one of his kids' school concerts or plays. Patricia, who everyone called Patty, worked part-time at the Riverside Public Library. She was the opposite of her husband, warm, talkative, always organizing bake sales for the school or volunteering at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church. The Holloway home was the kind where neighborhood kids always seemed to gather, drawn by Patty's famous chocolate chip cookies and the fact that she treated every child like they were her own. For Timmy, childhood in Riverside was about as perfect as it gets. He was the kind of kid who made friends easily, not because he was the most athletic or the smartest, but because he had this genuine kindness that people gravitated toward. His fifth-grade teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Pierce, would later describe him as the child who noticed when someone was sitting alone at lunch and would go sit with them. Timmy wasn't what you'd call a natural athlete. He was a bit clumsy, actually, all elbows and knees, the kind of kid who'd trip over his own feet during PE class. But he loved being outside. He'd spend hours in the woods behind his house, building elaborate forts with his best friend, Danny Kovach, who lived 3 doors down. The two boys were inseparable, riding bikes, catching crawdads in the creek, reading comic books in the treehouse Danny's father had built. But Timmy's real passion was his paper route. Now, I know that might sound strange, a kid being passionate about delivering newspapers, but you have to understand what a paper route meant in 1978. It wasn't just a job. It was a badge of honor, a sign that you were responsible enough to handle real work. Timmy had begged his parents for months to let him take over the route when old Mr. Henderson retired. He was only 10 years old when he started, which was young even then, but he'd convinced his parents he could handle it, and handle it he did. Every single morning at 5:30 a.m., without fail, Timmy would roll out of bed, throw on whatever clothes were closest, and head out on his bright red Schwinn bicycle with the wire basket attached to the handlebars. He had 47 customers on his route, and he knew every single one of them by name. He knew that Mrs. Davenport at 423 Oak Street wanted her paper placed inside the screen door, not on the porch where it might get wet. He knew that Mr. Chen at the corner of Maple and 3rd always had an extra $1 tip on Sundays. He knew that the Johnson's German Shepherd Bruno looked fierce but was actually a softie who'd wag his tail for a scratch behind the ears. Timmy took pride in his route. He kept a little notebook where he tracked his collections, and he never missed a single delivery, even when he had the flu and his mother had to practically tackle him to keep him in bed. His father would joke that Timmy was more reliable than the post office, and there was truth in that. In a town like Riverside, where people depended on getting their morning news with their morning coffee, Timmy Holloway was a fixture as dependable as sunrise itself. The Holloway family dynamic was, by all accounts, remarkably healthy for the 1970s. This was an era before helicopter parenting, before GPS tracking and cell phones. Kids roamed free, and parents trusted them to come home when the streetlights came on. Sunday mornings meant church at Street Andrews, followed by a big family breakfast that Patty would spend hours preparing pancakes, bacon, scrambled eggs, the works. Sunday afternoons were for family time board games, or drives out to the coast, or just sitting around reading while rain pattered against the windows. Timmy's sisters doted on him, despite the typical sibling squabbles. Linda, who was 15 in 1978, was the protective oldest child who'd threaten any kid who even looked at her little brother wrong. Susan, 13, was the family artist, always drawing portraits of Timmy that made him look far more heroic than any 11-year-old actually looked. In the fall of 1978, Timmy was in 6th grade at Riverside Middle School. He was struggling a bit with math. Fractions were his nemesis, but excelling in English class, where his teacher, Mr. Bernard Foster, encouraged his creative writing. Timmy had started writing these elaborate adventure stories about a detective named Captain Midnight who solved mysteries. Mr. Foster saved every single one of those stories. He'd later say that losing Timmy was like losing one of his own children. Life in the Holloway household followed comfortable rhythms. Robert would come home from the mill covered in sawdust, kiss his wife, and ask about everyone's day. Patty would have dinner-ready meatloaf on Mondays, spaghetti on Wednesdays, fish on Fridays, because Robert insisted on maintaining that Catholic tradition even though they were Lutheran. Timmy would do his homework at the kitchen table while his mother prepared food, asking her to quiz him on vocabulary words or help him with those troublesome fractions. I want you to really picture this family, because it's important to understand what was lost. The Holloways weren't rich. They weren't famous. They were just a normal, loving, middle-class American family living in a small Oregon town where the biggest worry was whether the mill would have enough orders to keep Robert employed through the winter. If you're listening to this from a small town yourself, drop a comment and let me know where you're from. I love hearing about the communities that support this channel. These stories are about real places and real people, and sometimes I think those of us from small towns understand the impact of these cases in a different way. October in Riverside was beautiful. The maple trees that gave the street its name would turn brilliant shades of red and gold, and the morning air had that crisp quality that made you want to wrap your hands around a hot cup of coffee. Kids were excited about Halloween, which was just 2 weeks away. Timmy had been planning his costume for months. He was going to be Luke Skywalker, because Star Wars had come out the year before and every kid in America wanted to be Luke Skywalker. On the evening of October 16th, 1978, the Holloway family had a perfectly normal night. Patty made her famous pot roast. Linda complained about her biology homework. Susan showed everyone her latest drawing, a portrait of the family dog, Rusty, that actually looked remarkably like Rusty. Timmy was excited because he'd gotten an A- on his latest Captain Midnight story, and Mr. Foster had written, "Excellent work," in the margin. After dinner, Timmy helped his father sort the newspapers for the morning route. This was part of their routine. Robert would drive to the distribution point at 9 p.m. and pick up the bundled papers, and he and Timmy would spend 30 minutes folding them and loading them into the canvas bags Timmy used for his route. It was father-son time, quiet but comfortable. Robert would later remember that Timmy was chattering about Halloween, about how Danny's mom had agreed to make them both costumes, about how he hoped to collect enough candy to last until Christmas. At 9:45 p.m., Timmy headed upstairs for his shower. At 10 p.m., he was in bed. Patty came in to kiss him goodnight, and she later recalled that he asked her if she thought Bruno the German Shepherd would like a Halloween treat. "I think Bruno would like anything you gave him, sweetie," she told him. "I'm going to save him a piece of my candy," Timmy had said. "Maybe a Snickers. Dogs can eat peanut butter, right?" Those were the last words Patricia Holloway would ever hear her son speak. At 5:15 a.m. on October 17th, 1978, Timmy Holloway's alarm clock went off. He had an old-fashioned wind-up alarm that made a sound like an angry cricket. His mother would later say she heard it from the master bedroom, heard the distinctive squeak of Timmy's bed springs as he got up, heard the soft padding of his feet across the floor. Timmy got dressed in the dark. A pair of jeans, a Riverside Raven sweatshirt, the middle school's mascot, his worn Converse sneakers, and a bright yellow raincoat because the forecast called for morning fog and possible drizzle. He crept downstairs as quietly as he could, trying not to wake anyone. This was his routine. His parents trusted him to get up, do his route, and be back by 7 a.m. for breakfast before school. The last person to see Timmy Holloway alive was his next-door neighbor, Arthur Brennan, who was 68 years old and an early riser himself. Mr. Brennan was having his morning coffee on his porch, something he did every single day, rain or shine. He saw Timmy wheeling his red Schwinn out of the garage, the canvas bags full of newspapers hanging from the handlebars. "Morning, Timmy," Mr. Brennan had called out. "Morning, Mr. Brennan," Timmy had called back, waving. "Going to be a foggy one today," Mr. Brennan had said. "I've got my reflectors," Timmy had replied, pointing to the reflectors he'd attached to his bike spokes. And then Timmy Holloway pedaled off into the pre-dawn fog, following a route he'd taken hundreds of times before. He would never come home. The fog that morning was particularly thick, the kind that reduces visibility to maybe 15 or 20 feet. In Riverside, October, fog wasn't unusual. It rolled in from the valley and settled into the streets like a cold, damp blanket. For Timmy Holloway, it meant being extra careful on his route, making sure to stay close to the curb, making sure drivers could see his reflectors. Timmy's paper route was efficient. He'd mapped it out himself to minimize backtracking. He'd start on Maple Street, work his way down to Oak Street, cross over to Pine Avenue, circle through the neighborhood, and end up back near his house. On a good day, with no stops to chat with customers, He could finish the whole thing in about an hour and 15 minutes. His first deliveries went smoothly. Mrs. Davenport's paper inside the screen door at 5:37 a.m. The Chen family's paper at the corner, carefully wrapped and placed in their milk box at 5:42 a.m. The Johnson's house, where he stopped to give Bruno a quick pet through the fence at 5:48 a.m. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. At approximately 6:15 a.m., Timmy was seen by another early morning person, Janet Rodriguez, who worked the opening shift at the Riverside diner and was driving to work. She later told police she'd seen a boy on a red bike with newspapers heading south on Pine Avenue toward the edge of town. She remembered because the fog was so thick that she'd slowed down, worried about hitting the kid. That sighting placed Timmy near the final few houses on his route, in an area where Riverside started transitioning from residential homes to the more rural, wooded areas that surrounded the town. And then, nothing. Timmy Holloway simply vanished. At 7:15 a.m., Patricia Holloway started to worry. Timmy was late. Not drastically late, but late enough that it was unusual. Her son was never late. She told herself he'd probably stopped to talk with one of his customers, or maybe he'd had a flat tire. By 7:30 a.m., when Timmy still hadn't appeared, Patricia called her husband at the mill. Robert immediately left work and started driving Timmy's route, looking for any sign of his son or the red Schwinn bicycle. At 8:05 a.m., when Timmy hadn't shown up for school, the Riverside Middle School secretary called the Holloway home. Patricia's voice was already shaking when she answered. No, Timmy wasn't there. Yes, they were looking for him. No, this wasn't like him at all. At 8:30 a.m., Robert Holloway found his son's bicycle. It was lying on its side in a drainage ditch about a quarter-mile past the last house on Timmy's route, where Pine Avenue turned into a rural road that led out toward the state forest. The canvas bags were still attached to the handlebars, but there were only 5 newspapers left inside. Timmy had delivered most of his route. The bike's front wheel was bent at an odd angle, as if it had been thrown or dropped from a height. But there was no sign of Timmy. Robert Holloway would later say that the moment he saw that red bicycle lying in the ditch, he knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. His son would never have left his bike like that. Never. Timmy took care of his things. He was responsible. Robert immediately drove to the nearest payphone. This was 1978. Remember? No cell phones. And called the Riverside Police Department. At 8:47 a.m., the search for Timothy James Holloway officially began. The Riverside Police Department was small, just a chief, 2 detectives, and 6 patrol officers for the entire town. But they took the disappearance seriously from minute one. Chief Walter Hartley, a 30-year veteran who'd known the Holloway family for years, immediately called in every available officer and put out a request for assistance from the Oregon State Police. By 10 a.m., more than 50 people were searching. Police officers, volunteers from the community, members of St. Andrew's Lutheran Church, workers from the lumber mill who'd left their shifts to help. They spread out from where the bicycle had been found, combing through the ditches, the fields, and the edge of the state forest. The fog was still thick, making the search difficult. People were calling out Timmy's name, their voices muffled and strange in the heavy air. Patty Holloway was at home with her daughters, sitting by the phone, praying. She'd wanted to join the search, but Chief Hartley had gently convinced her to stay put in case Timmy tried to call or come home. The search continued all day. Dogs were brought in German shepherds trained for search and rescue. Helicopters from the state police hovered overhead once the fog finally started to lift around 2 p.m. News crews from Portland, 60 miles away, arrived and set up on Main Street, interviewing anyone who'd talk to them. The story was already spreading. 11-year-old boy vanishes during paper route. By nightfall on October 17th, there was still no sign of Timmy Holloway. The search was called off for the night, with plans to resume at first light. Robert and Patricia Holloway sat in their living room, surrounded by family and friends, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but wait and pray. If you're listening to this and you have kids, I can't even imagine what you're feeling right now. If this story is affecting you, take a break if you need to. But also, and I say this because these stories need to be told, please leave a rating if you're on a podcast platform. It helps other people find these cases, and it helps families know that people still care. October 18th, 1978. Day 2 of the search. At 7:23 a.m., a volunteer searcher named Marcus Webb, who worked as a logger and knew the forest better than almost anyone, made a discovery that would shatter the Holloway family forever. About 2.5 miles into the state forest, accessible only by a narrow, rarely used logging road, Marcus found a child's body. The body was partially concealed under brush and fallen leaves, as if someone had made a hasty attempt to hide it. Marcus immediately radioed for help, then stood guard over the scene, tears streaming down his face because he had a son just about this age, and he knew everyone knew this was Timmy Holloway. Police and emergency personnel arrived within minutes. Chief Hartley took one look and had to step away to compose himself. The medical examiner from Portland was called. Crime scene investigators from the state police began documenting everything. The scene told a horrific story. Timmy Holloway had been sexually assaulted and strangled. His Riverside Raven sweatshirt was missing. His yellow raincoat was torn. His Converse sneakers were still on his feet. The medical examiner would later determine that he'd been killed somewhere between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m. on October 17th, within an hour of being last seen by Janet Rodriguez. There was physical evidence at the scene. Blood that didn't appear to be Timmy's, fibers that didn't match his clothing, hair samples that weren't his, tire tracks on the logging road, signs of a struggle. In 1978, DNA testing didn't exist, but investigators carefully collected everything, photographed everything, documented everything. The killer had been interrupted or had panicked. The hasty concealment of the body suggested someone who didn't have time for a careful cover-up. The location suggested someone who knew these logging roads. Someone familiar with the forest. At 11:30 a.m. on October 18th, 1978, Robert and Patricia Holloway received the news that every parent dreads: their son was dead. Their bright, kind, reliable boy, who loved his paper route and wanted to be a detective when he grew up, would never come home again. The town of Riverside, Oregon, went into mourning. The murder of Timothy Holloway wasn't just a tragedy, it was an earthquake that shook the very foundation of what Riverside understood itself to be. This was a town where people didn't lock their doors, where children rode their bikes freely, where paper routes and playing in the woods were considered normal, safe activities. All of that changed on October 18th, 1978. Parents immediately pulled their children off paper routes. Kids who'd walked to school for years were now driven by anxious mothers and fathers. The Johnsons brought Bruno inside at night. Locks that had never been used were suddenly engaged. The hardware store sold out of deadbolts within 3 days. But beyond the community fear, there was a massive criminal investigation underway. The Oregon State Police took the lead, designating Senior Detective Frank Castellano as the primary investigator. Castellano was a 25-year veteran, known for his meticulous approach to cases. He'd worked homicides before, but never a child murder. Years later, he'd say that the Holloway case changed him. that he never quite looked at the world the same way after seeing what had been done to that little boy. The investigation started with the evidence from the scene. Forensic specialists analyzed everything. The blood type found at the scene was type O, different from Timmy's type A positive. That immediately told investigators they were looking for a perpetrator with type O blood. The hair samples were analyzed brown human hair, likely from a Caucasian male. Fiber evidence suggested dark blue denim, and possibly a plaid flannel shirt. The tire tracks on the logging road were photographed and cast in plaster. They matched a common tire brand, Goodyear Wranglers, the kind used on pickup trucks and some SUVs. In 1978 rural Oregon, that was like saying the vehicle had 4 wheels. Half the men in town drove pickup trucks with Goodyear Wranglers. But it was a start. Detective Castellano's team began the enormous task of interviewing everyone. And I mean everyone. Every single person on Timmy's paper route. Every parent of every child at Riverside Middle School. Every employee at the lumber mill. Every regular at the Riverside Diner. Every person who might have been out early that foggy October morning. The interviews revealed something troubling. Multiple people reported seeing an unfamiliar dark-colored pickup truck in the neighborhood that morning. Janet Rodriguez, who'd seen Timmy on his bike, remembered a truck passing her going the opposite direction around 6:20 a.m. Arthur Brennan, who'd said good morning to Timmy, recalled a truck parked on Pine Avenue the previous evening, which was unusual because that wasn't a through street. There was no reason for someone to park there unless they lived there, and he didn't recognize the vehicle. Police created a timeline. Timmy left home at approximately 5:25 a.m. He was seen by Mr. Brennan at 5:28 a.m. He delivered papers on Maple Street between 5:30 and 5:50 a.m. He was seen by Janet Rodriguez at 6:15 a.m. on Pine Avenue. His bicycle was found at 8:30 a.m. His body was found at 7:23 a.m. the next day, with time of death estimated between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m. on October 17th. This meant the window for abduction was incredibly narrow, probably between 6:15 a.m. and 7 a.m. Detectives developed a theory. Someone had been waiting. This wasn't a random encounter. The killer knew Timmy's route, knew his timing, and had positioned himself to intercept the boy during the most isolated part of the route, where Pine Avenue transitioned to that rural road. This was premeditated. The investigation expanded to sex offenders. In 1978, sex offender registries weren't what they are today, but police tracked down every known offender in a 50-mile radius. Each one was interviewed, asked to account for their whereabouts on the morning of October 17th, asked to voluntarily provide blood samples. Several refused to provide blood samples. Police obtained warrants. One by one, suspects were eliminated. The blood types didn't match. The alibis checked out. They were in Portland or Eugene, or accounted for at their jobs. The detectives looked at people close to the family. This is standard procedure. Statistically, most children are harmed by people they know. But the Holloways had a small, tight-knit circle. Robert's co-workers at the mill were all cleared. Patty's colleagues at the library were cleared. The family had no suspicious relatives, no strange hangers-on, no one who set off alarm bells. They investigated Timmy's teachers, his scout leaders, his friends' parents. Every man who had regular contact with the boy was interviewed and cleared. The dark-colored pickup truck became the focus. Police put out a public appeal. If you owned or had access to a dark-colored pickup truck in October 1978, please come forward. The response was overwhelming. 172 people called in. Every single one was interviewed. Every single truck was examined. None matched all the evidence. Weeks turned into months. The investigation consumed thousands of hours. Detective Castellano worked 18-hour days, sleeping in his office, surviving on coffee and determination. He developed suspects, pursued leads, interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses. A composite sketch was created based on a description from a woman who lived near the logging road. She'd seen a man in a dark pickup truck on October 16th, the evening before the murder. The sketch showed a white male, possibly in his 20s or 30s, with dark hair and a mustache. The sketch was distributed to every police department in Oregon and published in newspapers statewide. Tips poured in. Each one had to be followed up. Each one led nowhere. The investigation hit dead ends at every turn. Without DNA testing, without cell phone records, without security cameras, detectives were limited to traditional investigative techniques, and those techniques weren't producing results. By Christmas 1978, the case was stalling. By the first anniversary of Timmy's death in October 1979, it had gone cold. But Detective Frank Castellano never gave up. He kept a photograph of Timmy Holloway on his desk, that school picture with the gap-toothed smile and the freckles. He'd look at it every day and promise that boy he'd find who did this. Castellano would work the case for the next 23 years, until his retirement in 2001. He'd follow up on every new tip, every new possibility. He'd attend conferences on forensic techniques, hoping to learn something that might help. When DNA testing became available in the late 1980 seconds, he immediately had all the evidence from the Holloway case analyzed and entered into databases, but nothing hit. No matches, no breakthroughs. The case file grew to over 3,000 pages. Hundreds of people interviewed, dozens of suspects investigated and cleared, thousands of investigative hours logged. And still, the identity of Timothy Holloway's killer remained unknown. For the Holloway family, life went on in the way that life does, even after unimaginable tragedy. But it was a different life, a smaller life, a life marked by absence. Robert Holloway continued working at the lumber mill, but people who knew him said he was never quite the same. The quiet man became even quieter. He aged decades in the span of a few years. Patricia threw herself into volunteer work at the library and the church, perhaps trying to find meaning in the meaningless. Linda went to college in Seattle, as far from Riverside as she could get while still being in the Pacific Northwest. Susan became a therapist, perhaps trying to heal others because she couldn't heal herself. The family never moved from the house on Maple Street. Timmy's bedroom stayed exactly as he'd left it. The Captain Midnight stories on his desk, his comic books on the shelf, his Converse sneakers by the door. Patricia couldn't bear to change it. For years, decades even, that room was a shrine to a boy who would be forever 11 years old. Every October 17th, the family held a small memorial at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church. Every year, fewer people attended. Not because the town forgot Riverside would never forget, but because life moves on, and grief has a way of becoming private over time. Detective Castellano attended every memorial until his retirement. When he finally had to pass the case to a younger detective, he made that detective promise to keep trying. "Don't let Timmy become just another cold case file," he'd said. And for 43 years, that's what Timothy Holloway was. A cold case, an unsolved mystery, a tragedy without resolution. The Riverside Police Department reviewed the case annually. New detectives would look at it with fresh eyes, hoping to spot something their predecessors had missed. When new forensic technologies emerged, they'd apply them to the evidence. The DNA profile of the killer had been established and entered into multiple databases, CODIS, GEDmatch, others. But year after year, there were no matches. By 2020, Robert Holloway had passed away. never knowing who killed his son. Patricia was in her mid-70s, her health failing, her hope long since faded. Linda and Susan were middle-aged women with children of their own, children who never got to meet their Uncle Timmy, who only knew him from stories and photographs. The case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. But sometimes, the most unlikely people become heroes. Before we get to that part, and trust me, it's worth the wait, I want to ask a favor. If you're enjoying this story, if you're as captivated as I am by these details, please leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me if you remember cases like this from your own hometown. These stories matter, and hearing from you all reminds me why I keep telling them. Rebecca Martinez was born in 2002, 24 years after Timothy Holloway's murder. She grew up in Sacramento, California, in a world that would have seemed like science fiction to the people of 1978 Riverside. Cell phones, internet, DNA databases, social media, security cameras everywhere. Rebecca was the oldest of 3 daughters in a Mexican-American family. Her father, Carlos, was a firefighter. Her mother, Elena, was an emergency room nurse. From an early age, Rebecca was drawn to stories of justice, or the lack thereof. She'd watch forensic files with her mother. Fascinated by how science could solve crimes, she'd read true crime books meant for adults when she was still in middle school. Her parents worried she was developing an unhealthy obsession, but Rebecca saw it differently. She saw puzzles that needed solving. She saw families that needed closure. She saw justice that needed to be served. In high school, Rebecca was that kid, the one who got perfect grades without seeming to try, who tutored other students in biology and chemistry, who ran the school's forensic science club. She was intense, focused, driven. While other teenagers were worried about prom dates and college parties, Rebecca was reading academic papers about genetic genealogy and forensic DNA analysis. She graduated as valedictorian in 2020, right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Her graduation ceremony was virtual. Her college acceptance to Oregon State University's highly competitive forensic science program came through email. Everything that year was strange, disconnected, uncertain, but Rebecca knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life. Oregon State's forensic science program is one of the best in the country. It's small, they only accept about 30 students per year, and the curriculum is brutal. Organic chemistry, molecular biology, criminal law, ethics, laboratory techniques, and more. Students are expected to maintain at least a 3.5 gigapascals or they're removed from the program. Rebecca thrived. By her junior year, she was working as a research assistant in the university's forensic genetics laboratory, helping graduate students with their research projects. She was learning cutting-edge techniques in DNA analysis. She was studying genetic genealogy, the same technique that had finally caught the Golden State Killer in 2018. For those of you who don't know what genetic genealogy is, here's the simple version. You take DNA from a crime scene and upload it to public genealogy databases like GE Deadmatch. These databases contain genetic information from people who voluntarily uploaded their DNA results from services like 2, 3andMe, or Ancestry.com. You look for matches, usually distant relatives, third cousins, or fourth cousins. Then you build family trees, working backward to common ancestors and forward through all their descendants, until you identify someone who could be your suspect. It's detective work meets genealogy, meets genetics. It's time-consuming, painstaking, and requires both scientific knowledge and the ability to build complex family trees. It's also incredibly effective. Rebecca had helped her professor, Dr. Sarah Chen, on several academic research projects involving genetic genealogy. She understood the science. She understood the genealogy. And she had something else, an obsessive attention to detail that made her perfect for this kind of work. In the fall of 2021, Rebecca was starting her senior year. She needed to complete a capstone project, basically a thesis that demonstrated her mastery of forensic science. Most students chose controlled experiments or literature reviews. Rebecca wanted to do something different. She wanted to solve an actual cold case. Her professor was skeptical. "Rebecca, these cases are cold for a reason, Doctor," Chen had told her. "Law enforcement has usually thrown everything they have at them. What makes you think you can succeed where trained detectives have failed?" Rebecca's response was simple. "Because I have tools they didn't have. Because I can approach it differently. Because somebody has to try." Dr. Chen couldn't argue with that logic. She agreed to supervise the project. With one condition. Rebecca had to get permission from an actual law enforcement agency to work on their case. So Rebecca did what any determined college student in 2021 would do. She started researching. She spent weeks combing through databases of unsolved homicides. She was looking for specific criteria. Cases old enough that traditional investigation had stalled, but recent enough that DNA evidence had been collected and preserved. Cases that involved victims who deserved justice. Cases where families were still waiting for answers. That's when she found the Timothy Holloway case. The photograph, that school picture with the gap-toothed smile, stopped her cold. Rebecca later said she couldn't explain it, but something about this case grabbed her and wouldn't let go. An 11-year-old boy, murdered during his paper route. A family that had waited 43 years for justice. A killer who'd never been identified. She read everything she could find. Old newspaper articles from the Riverside Chronicle, the official case summary on the Oregon State Police website, forum discussions on true crime websites. She learned about Detective Castellano's decades-long obsession with the case. She learned about the evidence that had been preserved. She learned about the DNA profile of the killer that sat in databases, waiting for a match that had never come. And she learned that Patricia Holloway was still alive, still waiting, still hoping. Rebecca made a decision. She was going to solve this case. The first step was contacting the Riverside Police Department. In 2021, Riverside had grown to about 15,000 people, but it was still a small town with a small police force. The case was technically still under the jurisdiction of the Oregon State Police, but the local department maintained the files and handled any new leads. Rebecca wrote an email to Chief Diana Ortega, who'd taken over as chief in 2018. She introduced herself, explained her background, described her capstone project, and respectfully asked for permission to work on the Timothy Holloway case using genetic genealogy techniques. She expected to be ignored. Instead, Chief Ortega called her personally 3 days later. "Are you serious about this?" Chief Ortega had asked. "Completely serious," Rebecca had replied. "Do you understand that this case has been worked by some of the best investigators in the state for 43 years? "Yes, ma'am. But they didn't have the tools I have." There was a long pause on the phone. Then Chief Ortega said something that would change everything. "I've been chief here for 3 years. Every month, without fail, an elderly woman calls my office and asks if there's any news about her son's case. Her name is Patricia Holloway. If you can give that woman answers before she dies, I'll give you every resource we have." And just like that, Rebecca Martinez was officially working on the Timothy Holloway murder investigation. At 19 years old, as a college student, with no badge, no authority, and nothing but her knowledge and determination. The partnership was unusual, to put it mildly. Chief Ortega had to sell it to the Oregon State Police, who were understandably skeptical. A teenager? A college kid? Working on one of their most notorious cold cases? But Chief Ortega was persuasive. She pointed out that genetic genealogy had solved dozens of cold cases across the country. She pointed out that Rebecca's expertise in this specific technique was probably better than anyone on their staff. She pointed out that they had literally nothing to lose. The case had been cold for 43 years. The state police agreed, with conditions. Rebecca would work under supervision. She'd share all her findings with investigators. She'd sign confidentiality agreements. She wouldn't speak to the media, and if she did solve it, the state police would handle all the public announcement. Rebecca agreed to everything. She didn't care about credit. She cared about justice. In October 2021, 43 years to the month after Timothy Holloway's murder, Rebecca Martinez received full access to the case files, all the preserved evidence, and the complete DNA profile of the killer. The real work was about to begin. I'm going to take a quick break in the story here to say, if this case is drawing you in, if you want to hear more stories like this, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. These videos take dozens of hours to research and produce, and your support means everything. Okay, back to Rebecca's investigation. Rebecca Martinez's dorm room at Oregon State University became command central for the Timothy Holloway investigation. She covered an entire wall with a timeline, printed photographs, maps of Riverside, and family trees. Her roommate, who was a business major and had zero interest in true crime, thought Rebecca had completely lost her mind. You have printouts covering every inch of our wall. Her roommate, Jessica, had complained. I'll take them down when I solve it, Rebecca had replied, not looking up from her laptop. You're obsessed. Yes, I am. The first step was getting the killer's DNA profile into the right databases. The Oregon State Police had already entered it into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, years ago, with no hits. They'd also tried GEDmatch, a public genealogy database, but that was back in 2019, before Rebecca's involvement. Rebecca tried again, using slightly different search parameters. She uploaded the DNA profile to every available genetic genealogy database: GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and several smaller databases that specialized in genetic research. And then she waited. Genetic genealogy doesn't produce instant results like they show on TV crime dramas. The databases have to process the DNA data, compare it against millions of genetic profiles, and identify potential matches. This can take days or even weeks. While she waited, Rebecca dove into the case files. All 3,000 pages. She read every single interview transcript. She studied every photograph from the crime scene. She reviewed Detective Castellano's notes, which were meticulous and heartbreaking. You could see his frustration building over the years. She created a detailed profile of what they knew about the killer. Male, likely Caucasian based on hair evidence. Type O blood, probably in his 20s or 30s in 1978, which would make him in his 60s or 70s in 2021. Knew the area well enough to know about that logging road. Drove a dark-colored pickup truck. Either lived in Riverside or had reason to be there regularly. The composite sketch from 1978 was interesting but not particularly useful. The witness had only glimpsed the person from a distance, and memories from 43 years ago were unreliable anyway. 2 weeks after uploading the DNA, Rebecca got her first hit. It wasn't a direct match. Those are extremely rare, unless the killer themselves had uploaded their DNA to a genealogy website, which would be spectacularly stupid. Instead, it was a third cousin match. Someone in the database shared approximately 1.5% of their DNA with the killer, indicating they shared a common great-great-grandparent. Rebecca's hands actually shook when she saw the notification. This was real. This was the beginning. The match was with a user identified only as Sarah P., 1,956. Rebecca messaged her through the database's internal system, explaining that she was working with law enforcement on a genetic genealogy investigation and asking if Sarah would be willing to share her family tree. 3 days later, Sarah responded. She was Sarah Patterson, a retired schoolteacher from Phoenix, Arizona. She'd uploaded her DNA out of curiosity to learn about her heritage. Yes, she'd be happy to help. She sent Rebecca access to her family tree, which she'd been building for years as a hobby. This is where genetic genealogy becomes part science, part genealogy, and part detective work. Rebecca had to work backward from Sarah Patterson, tracing her family tree back several generations to identify the common ancestors she shared with the killer. Then she had to work forward, identifying all the descendants of those common ancestors. It's extraordinarily time-consuming work. Imagine building a family tree for dozens of people across multiple generations, trying to track down birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, and more. And you have to be absolutely meticulous, because one mistake can send you down a completely wrong branch of the family tree. Rebecca worked on it every spare moment. Between classes, late into the night, on weekends, she drank alarming amounts of coffee. She stopped going to social events. Her friends worried about her. Her parents called and asked if she was okay. "I'm fine," she'd tell them. "I'm just busy." "Busy is an understatement, Mija," her mother had said. "You're obsessed. There's a woman in Oregon who's been waiting 43 years to know what happened to her son," Rebecca had replied. "I think she deserves for me to be a little obsessed." She built out Sarah Patterson's family tree, going back to the common ancestors born in the 1,882 in rural Oregon. Then she identified all their descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren. The tree grew to include hundreds of people. Then the real detective work began, narrowing down which branch of this massive family tree might contain the killer. Rebecca cross-referenced the family tree with what she knew about the case. The killer was likely in his 20s or 30s in 1978. That meant he was probably born between 1,945 and 1,958. He knew the Riverside area, which suggested he either lived there or had strong connections there. She started eliminating branches of the family tree. This branch moved to California in the 1,962. Unlikely. This branch produced only daughters. Can't be them. This person died in 1975. Can't be them. Slowly, methodically, she narrowed it down. By December 2021, Rebecca had identified 3 possible family branches that fit the profile. Within those branches were 17 men who would have been the right age in 1978 and had connections to Oregon. Now came the really difficult part, investigating each of those 17 men. Rebecca worked with Chief Ortega and the state police investigators. They'd locate each man, verify if they were still alive, check if they had a history that might make them a viable suspect, and try to obtain DNA samples for comparison. It was frustrating. Slow work. Some of the men had died decades ago. Some had moved out of state and were difficult to locate. Some were cleared immediately they'd been in the military overseas in 1978, or they'd been in prison, or their physical characteristics didn't match at all. One by one, suspects were eliminated. By March 2022, Rebecca was down to 4 possible candidates, and one of them was starting to look very interesting. His name was Donald Eugene Hartley. He'd been born in 1953, which made him 25 years old in 1978, right in the prime age range. He'd grown up in a small town about 15 miles from Riverside. He'd worked as a truck driver in the late 1972, which meant he drove a pickup truck and knew the back roads of the region. He'd never married, which wasn't conclusive, but was interesting. And most significantly, he'd been arrested in 1982 for attempted sexual assault on a minor charges that were ultimately dropped due to lack of evidence. Rebecca's instincts told her this was their guy, but there was a problem. Donald Eugene Hartley had died in 2003 of liver failure at the age of 50. He'd been cremated. His ashes had been scattered in the Pacific Ocean. How do we get DNA from ashes scattered in the ocean? Rebecca had asked Chief Ortega in frustration. We can't. Chief Ortega had admitted. We need to find another way. Rebecca refused to give up. She went deeper into Hartley's family tree. Did he have siblings? Children? Anyone who might have DNA that could confirm the relationship? Hartley had 2 siblings, a sister who died in 1998, and a brother, Richard Hartley, who was still alive and living in Portland, Oregon. Richard Hartley was 68 years old in 2022. He worked as a janitor at a community college. He had no criminal record. By all accounts, he was a quiet, unremarkable person who'd lived a very ordinary life. Rebecca and the investigators faced an ethical and legal question. How do you ask someone to provide DNA to prove their dead brother was a child murderer? They decided on transparency. Chief Ortega and a state police detective drove to Portland and knocked on Richard Hartley's door in April 2022. Mr. Hartley, we're investigating a very old homicide case, and we believe your brother Donald may have information that could help us. We'd like to ask you to voluntarily provide a DNA sample for comparison purposes. Richard Hartley had been shocked. He'd had no idea why they'd want his brother's DNA. But when they explained gently that Donald was a suspect in the 1978 murder of Timothy Holloway, Richard had gone very quiet. Then he'd said something that made Rebecca's heart race when she heard about it later. I always thought there was something wrong with him. Richard agreed to provide a DNA sample that day. A simple cheek swab, done right there in his living room, properly documented and witnessed. The sample was sent to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab for analysis. Rebecca was told it would take approximately 6 to 8 weeks to process and compare against the killer's DNA profile from the Holloway case. Those were the longest 6 weeks of Rebecca Martinez's life. She tried to focus on her other classes, on her other responsibilities, but every day she'd check her email obsessively, hoping for news. She'd lie awake at night thinking about Timothy Holloway, about his family, about whether she'd gotten it right. What if it wasn't Donald Hartley? What if she'd led the investigation down a dead end? What if she'd wasted everyone's time and resources? But what if it was him? What if she'd actually done it? What if she'd solved a 43-year-old murder? On June 2nd, 2022, Rebecca was sitting in her dorm room, studying for her final exams when her phone rang. It was Chief Ortega. Rebecca, I need you to sit down. I am sitting down. The DNA results came back. Rebecca's mouth went dry. And it's a match. Donald Eugene Hartley is Timothy Holloway's killer. You solved it. Rebecca Martinez, 19-year-old college student, had accomplished what 43 years of professional investigation hadn't. She'd identified Timothy Holloway's murderer. She started crying, just completely broke down. All the stress, all the obsession, all the late nights and doubt and pressure, it all came pouring out. And when she finally composed herself, her first thought was, Patricia Holloway is going to get her answers. On June 15, 2022, the Oregon State Police held a press conference at their headquarters in Salem. The room was packed with journalists, retired detectives who'd worked the case, members of the Riverside community, and sitting in the front row, 3 people who'd waited longer than anyone for this moment. Patricia Holloway, now 76 years old, sat flanked by her daughters, Linda and Susan. Patricia looked frail but composed, her hands folded in her lap. Linda held her mother's hand. Susan had tissues ready, because she knew this was going to be emotional. At the podium stood Lieutenant Marcus Freeman, the current lead investigator on cold cases for the Oregon State Police. Next to him stood Chief Diana Ortega from the Riverside Police Department. And somewhat uncomfortably, standing slightly to the side, was Rebecca Martinez, who'd been strongly encouraged to attend despite her preference to stay out of the spotlight. Lieutenant Freeman began. On October 17, 1978, 11-year-old Timothy James Holloway was murdered while delivering newspapers in Riverside, Oregon. For 43 years, this case has remained unsolved, despite the dedicated efforts of hundreds of law enforcement professionals. Today, I am pleased to announce that we can finally provide answers to the Holloway family and to the community. He paused, looking directly at Patricia Holloway. Through the use of advanced genetic genealogy techniques, we have identified Timothy's killer as Donald Eugene Hartley, who died in 2003. DNA evidence conclusively proves that Hartley was responsible for Timothy's abduction, sexual assault, and murder. The room erupted with questions, camera flashes, the sound of reporters typing frantically. But Patricia Holloway just sat very still, tears streaming down her face, nodding slowly, as if she'd been waiting her entire adult life to hear those words. Lieutenant Freeman continued, providing details. Donald Eugene Hartley had been 25 years old in 1978. He'd lived in Woodburn, Oregon, about 15 miles from Riverside, and worked as a long-haul truck driver. On October 17, 1978, he'd been on a route that took him through Riverside. It appeared he'd seen Timothy Holloway on his paper route, had waited for the boy to reach the isolated end of his route, and had abducted him. The attack had likely occurred in Hartley's truck. He'd then driven to the logging road, murdered Timothy, and attempted to conceal the body. He'd probably been interrupted or had panicked, which explained the hasty concealment. Hartley had no known connection to the Holloway family. This was a crime of opportunity, which made it all the more random and terrifying. In 1982, Hartley had been arrested for attempting to assault a 13-year-old girl in Eugene, Oregon. The case had fallen apart when the girl's family moved out of state and declined to participate in the prosecution. Hartley had walked free. He'd lived another 21 years after that, working various jobs, apparently managing to avoid committing any crimes serious enough to get his DNA into criminal databases. He died of liver failure in 2003, probably thinking he'd gotten away with it. The breakthrough in this case came through the work of a remarkable young woman, Lieutenant Freeman said, gesturing to Rebecca. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic science student at Oregon State University, used genetic genealogy to identify Hartley when traditional investigative methods had reached dead ends. Her dedication, expertise, and tireless work over the past 8 months made this identification possible. Chief Ortega stepped to the microphone. I want to emphasize that Rebecca's contribution to this case cannot be overstated. She volunteered her time and expertise out of a desire to bring justice to a family she'd never met. She represents the best of what forensic science can achieve. Then Patricia Holloway asked if she could speak. She walked slowly to the microphone, supported by her daughters. When she reached it, she looked out at the crowd of reporters and cameras, then down at the prepared statement someone had written for her. She pushed it aside. For 43 years, she said, her voice shaking but clear, I have wondered who took my son from me. I've wondered why. I've wondered if I'd die without ever knowing. Today, I know." She paused, composing herself. "Donald Hartley took my Timmy. He murdered my little boy who just wanted to do his paper route and save up money for Christmas presents. He took away my son's chance to grow up, to go to high school, to fall in love, to have children of his own. He took away my chance to see what kind of man Timmy would have become. I believe he would have been a good man. He was already a good boy." Patricia looked directly at Rebecca. "But today, I also want to thank someone. Rebecca, you don't know me. You never knew my Timmy, but you cared enough to spend months of your life working to give me answers. You gave me something I thought I'd never have the knowledge of who did this. It doesn't bring Timmy back. Nothing can do that. But it means I can finally rest, knowing his killer has been named. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." Rebecca was openly crying now, no longer even trying to hide it. The press conference continued with technical details, with timelines, with explanations of genetic genealogy, but the moment that mattered had already passed, the moment when a mother finally learned who had murdered her child. After the press conference, Patricia Holloway asked to meet with Rebecca privately. They sat in a small office at the police headquarters, just the two of them. "Tell me about yourself," Patricia had said. "I want to know who you are." And Rebecca did. She told Patricia about growing up in Sacramento, about her fascination with forensic science, about choosing to work on Timmy's case specifically because something about his story had moved her. "He deserved justice," Rebecca said, "and you deserved answers." Patricia reached across and took Rebecca's hand. "My husband died 5 years ago. He never knew who killed our son. It broke his heart. But I got to know because of you." "That's a gift I can't repay." "You don't need to repay it," Rebecca said. "This is what I'm supposed to do with my life. I know that now." They talked for almost an hour. Patricia showed Rebecca more photographs of Timmy, pictures from the case files didn't capture. Timmy learning to ride his bike. Timmy's first day of school. Timmy holding a fish he'd caught with his dad. "He was so proud of that fish," Patricia said, smiling through tears. "It was about 3 inches long, but you'd think he'd caught a whale to hear him tell it." Before they parted, Patricia said something that Rebecca would carry with her for the rest of her life. "You gave my boy his name back. For 43 years, when people talked about what happened in Riverside, it was the paper route murder or the Holloway case. Now, it can be about Timmy, about who he was, not just about what happened to him. Thank you for that." The media coverage of the case was extensive. The story had everything: an innocent victim, a decades-long mystery, a young hero, and advanced forensic technology bringing justice where traditional methods had failed. Rebecca did a handful of carefully selected interviews, always emphasizing that this wasn't about her, but about Timothy Holloway and his family. She deflected praise, instead highlighting the work of Detective Castellano and the dozens of investigators who'd kept the case alive for 4 decades. "I just happened to have the right tools at the right time," she'd say. "The detectives before me did the hard work of preserving evidence and building the foundation. I just added the final piece." But everyone knew it was more than that. Rebecca Martinez had shown persistence, skill, and dedication that went far beyond what could be expected of a college student working on a class project. She graduated from Oregon State University in June 2022 with a perfect 4 gigapascals. Her capstone project, the application of genetic genealogy in cold case investigation, the Timothy Holloway case study, was published in a forensic science journal and became required reading in forensic science programs across the country. By the time you're hearing this story, Rebecca has gone on to solve 6 more cold cases using similar techniques, She's now pursuing her PhD in forensic genetics and consulting with law enforcement agencies around the country. She's become one of the leading experts in genetic genealogy and criminal investigation, and she's only 22 years old. But if you ask her, she'll tell you the Timothy Holloway case is still the most important work she's ever done. It taught me that behind every case file is a family that needs answers, a victim who deserves justice, and a community that needs to heal. That's what drives me. For Riverside, Oregon, the solving of the case brought a kind of closure the community had needed for 43 years. The dark pickup truck that had haunted people's memories could finally be attached to a name. The monster who'd killed Timmy Holloway was no longer an unknown shadow. He was Donald Eugene Hartley, and he was dead. The town held a memorial service for Timothy in October 2022, on what would have been the 44th anniversary of his death. More than 500 people attended. Patricia Holloway, now able to grieve with some measure of peace, stood at the podium and talked about her son, not about how he died, but about how he lived, about his kindness, his reliability, his dreams of becoming a detective. In a way, Patricia said, Timmy got to solve his own case, because without his DNA evidence being preserved all those years, without the story of his case staying alive, Rebecca never would have found us. So maybe, in some way, my boy did become the detective he always wanted to be. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. The case of Timothy Holloway also led to policy changes in Oregon. The state legislature passed the Timothy Holloway Act in 2023, which provided funding for genetic genealogy investigations in unsolved homicide cases and mandated training for law enforcement in these techniques. It ensured that what Rebecca had done for the Holloway family could be done for other families waiting for answers. Patricia Holloway passed away peacefully in her sleep in November 2023. She was 77 years old. At her funeral, Linda and Susan talked about how their mother's final years had been marked by a peace that hadn't been there before. She'd known. She'd finally known who had taken her son, and that knowledge had allowed her to rest. Rebecca attended the funeral, sitting quietly in the back. Afterward, Linda approached her. "Mom wanted you to have something," Linda said, handing her a small box. Inside was Timmy's silver detective badge, a toy badge he'd gotten for Christmas when he was 7 years old and had treasured because he wanted to be a detective when he grew up. "She said you earned it," Linda told her. "You became the detective Timmy never got the chance to be." Rebecca still has that badge. She keeps it in her office, a reminder of why she does this work. So that's the story of Timothy Holloway and Rebecca Martinez. A story about a bright, kind 11-year-old boy whose life was cut short by evil. A story about a family that waited 43 years for answers. And a story about a determined young woman who refused to let those questions go unanswered. I want to take a moment here to acknowledge what this case represents. It's not just about solving a murder. It's about the power of persistence, the importance of preserving evidence even when solutions seem impossible, and the way new technologies can bring justice where traditional methods fail. It's also about families. Patricia Holloway waited 43 years. 43 years of wondering, of suffering, of hoping. And because Rebecca Martinez saw a photograph and decided to care, Patricia got her answers before she died. If you've made it this far in the story, first of all, thank you. These cases take a tremendous amount of time to research and write, and knowing that people are listening and caring makes all that work worthwhile. Second, I want to ask you to do something. If this story moved you, if you think more people should hear about Timothy Holloway and Rebecca Martinez, please share this with someone. Leave a rating. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. These actions seem small, but they help ensure that cases like this don't get forgotten, that victims like Timothy get remembered for who they were, not just how they died. I also want to say something to anyone listening who's waiting for answers in their own family's case. I see you. Your wait matters. Your loved one matters. And stories like this prove that cases can be solved, even decades later. Don't give up hope. Finally, to anyone out there who's thinking about going into forensic science, criminal investigation, or any field related to justice, do it. The world needs people like Rebecca Martinez. It needs people who see problems that seem unsolvable and say, I'm going to try anyway. It needs people who care about strangers, who lose sleep over cases that aren't even theirs, who refuse to let the years erase someone's story. Timothy Holloway was a real person. He loved his paper route, wanted to be a detective, and thought dogs could eat peanut butter. He had freckles and a gap-toothed smile, and a future that should have been long and happy. He deserves to be remembered as more than a victim, more than a cold case file. He deserves to be remembered as Timmy. And because of one determined college student with nothing but knowledge and persistence, he will be. Thank you for listening. Please take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.